Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe let's start with the level set, just the 2-minute version of Plaid. What is it?
Sure. So nobody here probably came to the last time it was at this meetup. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago.
Oh, just you wait.
6
We
years
have
ago?
something coming up.
Oh no, this is not going to be good. Anyway, so I've been at this meetup before. We gave a talk a long time ago and certainly attended a number of them. But Plaid, we build infrastructure for financial technology companies, financial services companies, to enable a consumer to interact with their bank account, generally via a third-party application. So you can think of us as the plumbing that connects your bank account to Venmo or Square Cash or any of these fintech products that you might be using. We're a data company, I guess you could say, more precisely data plumbing, data infrastructure, moving data back and forth. So perhaps a little bit less complex of a discussion as the last one we just had. But the way that we tend to think about it is trying to enable an ecosystem of developers and financial technology products to create these amazing consumer experiences. So when we started, banking was, and still largely is, a world that originally was built without envisioning the internet. It was built in a way that a consumer walks into a bank branch and talks to a banker. But you fast forward to today, and consumers are living these fully digital financial lives. They have most of their financial processes running through a finance folder on their iPhone or Android. And we do kind of the infrastructure plumbing between the bank itself and those applications. So our backend, we've integrated with about 15,000 banks in the US, Canada, and soon a bit further. And then we pull all those integrations into a single set of APIs. The thesis is that we want to give the consumer access to all the things that they would have access to if they were standing in a bank branch, but via a set of APIs that can then be embedded into a bunch of financial products. So we power about, I think it's 3,500, 4,000 financial products on the other side.
All right. So since we said we would, let's take back a step down memory lane. It's just 30 seconds, but I could not resist. Let's see if we can make it work.
We are by far the earliest company here. We are basically 3 guys sitting in a room coding 24 hours a day and building developer tools, which is fun and awesome, and tools that we really wished we had when we first started. So the way that we actually got to starting Plaid, which is basically a developer platform to aggregate and analyze card-linked data. So any way that people can spend, we can aggregate that and make it really, really interesting. And the way that we got started was we actually spent 6 months trying to build card-linked applications. So we had a couple small applications that we tried to build that didn't really go anywhere. We built a larger one called Sliver, and that was the goal of that was basically to pull in your entire history of spend and tell you the next place to go. So if we knew everywhere you'd been before, we thought that we could tell you the next best place to spend. So if you go to restaurants all the time, we'll match you with other restaurant people and tell you to go there. The issue.
So that's short-haired Zach.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened. I haven't had a haircut in a while.
You're already very good. I mean, what's amazing is that the vision is very much the same, right? So, I mean, to fast forward, so this was in February 2013, so 6 years ago, which was very much the very beginning of Plaid, and you know, it's just extraordinary, right? So, you know, the type of stuff VCs care about, but like, you know, at the time you were a pre-seed company and the latest round of financing was $250 million, valued you guys at what, 2.6 billion or 2.65, something like that? Or maybe that's not public.
Allegedly.
Okay, that's what it was reported.
The amount that we raised is public. It was reported 2.7.
Yeah. All right, 2.7. And you just like bought a company here in New York, Wovo, for 200 million. I mean, it's just like the craziest journey in 6 years. So what happened? So we'll talk about the product and all the things, and that's super interesting. But like just like taking a step back, I mean, what is a fundamental driver behind the success and I guess this whole explosion of fintech?
Well, day to day, it feels like we just have so much work to do. So. It's funny to see that video actually. The vision today is actually similar, though perhaps better articulated, but it's quite similar to what I said there. The idea being that there are going to be a huge host of products. There already are a huge host of products, and they will continue to grow. but these products that need to interact with your financial data for one reason or another. So let's take Lending Club, for example. As Lending Club is attempting to make a loan to a consumer, they need to get a bunch of data. Some of that comes from the credit bureaus, some of that comes from user input data, but a number of lenders, they also will ingest bank transaction data or bank statement data in order to understand your assets, verify that you have some cash flow, so on and so forth. They also need to figure out a way to fund that loan and collect the repayments. And so we build the kind of that infrastructure that allows it to happen. The video showed us talking about kind of card-linked data. That is a major data source for us. But of course, we're now a bit broader. So the thesis is more around kind of banking and financial services, not just cards. But to your question, we got lucky, right? We built infrastructure that we knew we needed. We couldn't predict how large FinTech would be or how fast it would grow. I like to think that Plaid had 1% to do with that growth because we gave some tools to some people that didn't have tools. But frankly, we got lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And then just lots of work to make sure the servers didn't go down.
Yeah, and to your point about using the tool that you needed. So you were starting to allude in that video to the fact that you guys actually started as a consumer app, right? And then people were not that kind-hearted in commenting on your app, but they really liked the backend tool. Is that the story?
Yeah, so that's a funny story. In the early days, we tried to build a consumer application that was linked to banking data. We built a bunch of different products. The one I was describing there was a restaurant recommendation product. That was a bad product. But the thesis early on was we wanted to create a tool that let consumers better manage their money, better understand their spend, better make financial decisions. So we built a series. We actually built, I think, 5 or 6 of them. I say 5 or 6 because I don't know if that last one even counted. But the first one was around recommending places where you could spend less money. One was around helping you budget and figure out how much to spend. And we had 2 fundamental problems when we were doing that, now looking back on it. First is that I don't understand anything about consumer apps. So we were building bad consumer applications. More specifically, we were creating products that didn't jive with the way that consumers want to be treated. We were telling consumers to spend less money. The automatic thing that you do when you get an application that tells you to spend less money is you delete the application and you don't look back at it. So part 1 is we failed in consumer psychology. But part 2 is we fundamentally had a lot of difficulty getting data from the banks. We were trying all these different services to use them. We were trying to build our own. And we found that along the way, building the infrastructure was a much more powerful way to get to where we were going. Again, the thesis was make money easier for everyone. We want to make money easier for people. We found that we could do so better by being a platform than we could by building a single given application. Yeah,
and to the thesis, I either read somewhere or in prior conversations, you had like this really interesting thought about how the bank account was evolving from being a vault to now being a routing layer. Do you want to talk about this?
Absolutely. So historically, people used to think about banks as the vault. You walk into a bank branch, you bring some money, you give it to your banker puts it in the vault. You need some money later, great, you ask your banker for it and they give it back to you. Maybe you ask them for a loan, anything else, but the bank is the vault, and your primary bank, we kind of call them big box banks, where they're truly everything to everyone. They will give you a checking account when you're 12 years old and have $25. They'll give you a mortgage when you need to buy a house, and they'll help you plan for retirement. The nuance for us, though, became when we started to look at the actual inflows and outflows into those accounts. If you looked at a lot of, especially millennials, if you looked at their bank statements, it's just a list of IO. So it's a list of money coming in from a checking account, getting transferred out to a friend via Venmo, paying their bills, paying their rent, so on and so forth. And so then we had this mindset shift where we said the bank account is actually the hub for your financial life. It's not the vault. And like any good hub, you would want it to be highly interconnected. And so kind of going into that thesis, we focused on creating easy connectivity for the bank account to touch all of the applications that you might need to interact with, such that now today, if you're trying to pay your rent, you can do so digitally. You don't have to write a check. Or if you're applying for a loan, you don't have to bring in this shoebox full of data. Most people bring in an actual or many people bring in an actual shoebox when they're applying for a mortgage. It's somewhere between 50 and 80 pages of documentation, and it takes 8 weeks. Now you can do so digitally by an automatic linkage.
So getting into the specifics of the product, so I think you guys started as a transaction. There was a transaction layer was the first one where you would connect with a bunch of bank accounts, extract data, and then enrich it with categorization, localization, the merchant, the categories, that type of thing. So that's still the core. And then what did you add?
So that is at the core of what we do. Actually, the name Plaid came from an early algorithm. One of the hardest challenges we faced early on was we get this stream of data for each user. You link an account, we pull in effectively your bank statement or your credit card statement, and then it says all of these really weird merchant names. So SBX43. What does that mean? It turns out that means Starbucks in Union Square, but we didn't know that. So we pulled in this stream of transaction data, started putting it on a map. We created this kind of canonical merchant database for all the merchants in the US and now more broadly. And then we just tried to do this matching. And so we started building more and more complex merchant matching algorithms. One of them was this cross-user comparison, where we compare your pattern to another set of persons' patterns, or to another person's patterns. And we ended up with this crosswork pattern. We said, oh, Plaid, all right, we'll add that to the list of names. And then later we went through and found out where we could buy the .com and so on and so forth. So that's how we got the name. But so at the core, we're a data plumbing company, kind of moving data from the place that it is to the place that it needs to be, doing a lot of enrichment along the way. The scale has gotten immense. So we released a couple of numbers recently. It's about 1 in 4 people in the US have linked an account with Plaid, which means that we're kind of processing all of the data coming through all those accounts on the other side. So truly, like we probably have more data engineering challenges than we have data science challenges today. Not to say data science is not an incredibly important team to us, but the heart of the company is really around data engineering.
Mm-hmm. And then on top of that transaction layer, what else do? You do identity. You do what else?
So we do kind of a bunch of straightforward products, so allowing you to monitor transactions, kind of set up ACH payments. We also have a set of other products around like checking a balance in real time. If you're about to do a payment, you might as well check that there are funds available to do that payment. We have identity validation products. We're working on a set of more specific lending products. So I talked a little bit about pulling in transaction data into a loan. Our longer term thesis is that you should be lending to a consumer in the way that you lend to a business, which is based on free cash flow. And so we can kind of pull that in and build a model around understanding free cash flow. So there's a lot of stuff there. And we have an assets product for lending as well. And then we're continuing to do more analytics on top of the data. So it's an immense pile of data that we have. Of course, we're doing things only that benefit the consumer. So you could imagine us building things around better risk and fraud, kind of simpler onboarding for a lot of these flows that we're seeing. It's a lot of data, but we need to be sure that the products that we're building are in the consumer's best interest.
So that's essentially the long-term vision. I mean, there's all these little bits of data everywhere in financial services, which are provided through forms and manual documents, and manually filled out documents. So you're going to go after every little bit of data. Is that the long-term vision? So
someone told me the other day that financial services is a $10 trillion market and it's 2% digital. I have not verified that stat, but it's a big market and it's not highly digital. And largely when people ask us who are the competitors you worry the most about, the answer is actually paper. So it's a human that is collecting data from a person and they're kind of like plugging bits into an Excel model and then coming back with an answer. That's largely what we're chasing after. So it's around digitization first, but then over time it becomes more and more about analytics and kind of value-added services on top of the data that's coming through the system. We're still in phase one. Phase one is scaling really well, and we're trying to kind of hold on to that. And over time, we'll shift to more of the analytics and value-added services.
So what have been some of the key data challenges? So is that purely like a scaling, sort of engineering, making sure the whole thing works, or was like the dirty data aspect of this, was that an issue? Was that something you solved reasonably early?
Yeah, so the earliest hooks that we had were just around categorization and cleansing. So could we identify a merchant well? Could we identify what was a check being deposited? Could we understand what someone's income level was based on the transaction data that was going on in their account? All of that stuff, it's pretty basic data science challenges, but it's important to do correctly, and it's important to do correctly at scale. So that was one of the big hooks for us early on. Then it shifted more into the mode of scaling. So kind of integrating with all of the banks that we have to integrate with, 15,000 banks having all sorts of different integration methodologies. So that means that we built a lot of really kind of smart infrastructure to look at these different banks and figure out how to do it. Data processing on our side was pretty intense with all the data coming through. Crazy challenges around like batch updates. So how do you schedule batch updates correctly to get the most fresh transaction data from the bank without taking their servers down because you have too much traffic? That is an actual challenge that we run into. So a lot of it does become around kind of like these infrastructural challenges. And now we're shifting back into a mode where kind of we've gone through a lot of the scaling, a lot of the infrastructure is built, and we can start to look at the data and think about what are the things that we can build that are a bit more forward charging. But truly, like a lot of the history has just been around scaling. It's funny, like we see ourselves very much as a data company, and we thought that data science in the early days would be a really key part of our strategy, and it is, but the data engineering challenge is so immensely harder that kind of data science kind of in terms of team size has come second.
That's great. How do you think about security? Because I mean, as a user, I pass on my credentials to you. How do you access my account? Like, I need to give you my stuff, right?
Yeah. So we have integrations with all the banks. These integrations are, as I said, a variety of formats. Everything from the bank building a custom API for us building an API for the bank, us integrating with some API that the bank has, kind of now all through a bunch of different ways to get the data. The core linkage functionality is a user comes to an application. Let's say you come to the Venmo app. You say, I want to connect my Chase account. And then you end up connecting via your user credentials. So we actually built a bit of infrastructure that sits embedded inside the Venmo app and every other Plaid customer. That bit of infrastructure does the credential collection, tokenizes it there on the client device, then passes it all the way through the system so that no one's touching that data. And then we have multi-factor authentication on top of it and so forth. But right now in financial services, still the best way to connect your bank account to anything is using your username and password. We've built a ton of infrastructure to secure that connectivity. But you can think of it kind of like OAuth, where the OAuth is effectively embedded into that application. It's not technically OAuth, but it behaves very similarly. So security for us, major concern, something that we think a great deal about. Many of our early engineers were security engineers, and we've always been kind of paranoid about it. We build one product. It processes data for banking, and if we mess up security, that is potentially company ending or likely company ending. So for us, it's been a major concern. We've actually built a number of software packages now that we're starting to externalize to kind of not just do the basics, but to validate against some of the larger threat vectors that we're seeing in the ecosystem. And now some of the banks are actually starting to buy those products, which is crazy to see it come full circle in that way. But we've always leaned into security as much as we can. You can never stop being paranoid, though. So that is, people ask me what my biggest fear about the company is. That is my biggest fear. And as much as we try to fix it, you can never be certain.
Great. So maybe switching from sort of product into maybe go-to-market and business. So you have this really interesting, I guess, situation, right? Where you need to sell to very different audiences, or at least convince different audiences. So the very traditional financial institutions on one side, and then on the other side, the developers and the fintechs. So maybe talking about the developers, like any lessons learned? I mean, that's a very finicky audience to sell to. How did you convince them, and what do you do to still get them excited about the company?
selling to developers has been fascinating. When we first started selling Plaid, we had a thesis that we could sell through developers who were building net new financial products. It was actually one of the members of the Venmo team that early on told us, hey, your consumer apps are terrible, but I'd like to use some of your infrastructure. Could we please license that? That's one of the reasons that we actually ended up making that full pivot, is that we knew there was a customer there on the other side. But for us, it's never been that much of a stretch to figure out how to sell to developers, because our company was entirely developers. And we had this thesis early on, which did not play out, by the way. We had a thesis that we never needed to hire PMs because the developers knew how to build an API for themselves. It kind of worked, but it didn't scale. So selling to developers for us, it's really about doing the basics. It's about building good infrastructure. It's about creating a set of documentation where your documentation is going to be your marketing page. So write really good documentation, and then kind of distribute it. And the distribution was a bit difficult at first. We were going to FinTech meetups. We came here. We talked about Plaid, trying to convince everyone to build products on Plaid. But kind of going to meetups, talking to people, getting use cases, finding a way to feature those use cases. Venmo early on was a great customer, and we saw a lot of people come and say, hey, how did Venmo do that? Can you do that with me? And then being like truly genuine to the developer community. So we actually, in a lot of ways, it's interesting. We integrate our recruiting process and our kind of go-to-market process, where we think every developer that we're interviewing to see if they want to come work at Plaid, they're also going to be a champion. So they better have a great experience. And so by really focusing on the developer as the champion, the developer as the core person that you're talking to as a company, we've been able to build a flywheel. But it took a long time. Developer sales, if you could even call it that, it's completely inbound. They come to your site, they say, hey, I'm interested in the product, can I sign up? Do I really have to talk to a person? No, I can sign up automatically without talking to a person. Great, let's go do that. So kind of respecting the way they want to buy was really important. And now our thesis is actually, as we start to scale up market, we go from just selling to developers and small companies to selling to developers and large companies, and now to enterprises. It's selling through the basement, what we call it. So can we activate developers? Can we get them to build on Plaid in their free time because they have fun and it's an interesting thing to build on? And we build good quick starts and so on and so forth. Can they build on Plaid for fun? Then when they actually have a challenge at work that needs Plaid, can they say, hey, let's use that? And then we kind of sell up through the bottom of the organization. So someone will contact us. We'll help a PM figure out how to sell up to their boss and their boss's boss and so forth to get the sales done, instead of the traditional SaaS model of selling top down.
Because the developer product is still free and you can use it for a while before you get charged, presumably.
Yeah, exactly. So you sign up on our site, you can build in the development environment for free. Over time, as your product scales, we start charging.
Okay. Has it helped with the other constituency? Have you seen some of the banks you were trying to convince? There was like the loan developer that happened to come across the tool and said, "Hey, our bank should be enabled by that." Or is it happening now?
We have a lot of that now. It didn't happen a lot at first. A lot of us was us going to the bank and saying, "Hey, we're gonna build this thing. We want to build this thing. Here's how it's gonna work." It's interesting, in the early days, there's a provision of Dodd-Frank that says that consumers must have access to a digital copy of their financial data. And we operated under this principle where consumers assigned us that, and we then went and collected the data from the bank. So the banks couldn't say no per se, but they certainly didn't have to make it easy. And so now we have very good relationships with the banks. They're our customers in many senses. Actually, most of the biggest banks are our customers. And that adds a lot of value back to the ecosystem, but it's always been tenuous to work with the financial institutions. In one sense, they need to enable their customer to do something. So they need to enable their customer to pay a friend or apply for a mortgage or whatever it is. On the flip side, though, they also want to be the one giving the customer that mortgage or that retirement account. And so there's a lot of push and pull. Those relationships are delicate.
And how did you get the flywheel started on that side initially? Who were the first few that said that they were happy to partner?
So I think American Express was the first bank, if you can call them a bank, that we launched. I think we kind of went top down from largest to smallest. The deeper partnerships, though, Chase is the one that we've been working on the longest. And if you look at our history in the press, you can see that we had good times with Chase, bad times with Chase, now very good times with Chase. But we really do go top down. We spend most of our time and attention focused on the largest banks, and the technical integrations we'll do with the smaller banks as well. But our business development team, which is a team unique to Plaid that only talks to banks, that is entirely focused on the largest banks.
Great. So what's next? You guys are starting to expand internationally, is that correct?
Someone wrote an article that we are hiring people in London. That is true. That is on our job site. I can't comment on anything else, but we do have roles in London.
This is interesting stuff that's happening in Europe, right, around banking data portability.
Yeah, PSD2. So in the same way that Dodd-Frank says that consumers shall have access in the US, there's actually more specific regulation in Europe about banks having to build APIs and so on and so forth. It's quite precise. That makes our job both easier and harder. Easier in that we can integrate with the banks more simply, that it's a straightforward process. Harder in that the banks actually, we now have to rely on certain pieces of bank infrastructure that, while long-term they will be good, they're just not very good yet. And so it's an interesting market. So definitely kind of thinking about where do we want to be. We're already in Canada. That's a good market for us. We believe a lot in that market. Thinking about other international markets, certainly. Kind of scalability in the US is a major focus for us. We're working on a number of kind of consumer enablement experiences. So we're a platform, completely a platform. Our customers are the ones that build the consumer apps, but there are certain elements of the consumer experience that are really important, such as making sure that the consumer understands data privacy, where their data is going, how it's going. So we're working on a set of tools around that to help the consumers better understand kind of what's going on there. And then, I mean, look, our customers tell us our product roadmap, right? They say, hey, I'm using this thing, it's not working, I need some help with this bit of identity validation or that bit of lending, and that's our product roadmap.
Great. All right. So maybe one last topic from me, and then we'll open up to people. Maybe some thoughts on the future of FinTech. Like, you had some interesting predictions. So where are we in that arc, right? From the vault we were talking about to the sort of the writing layer. What happens next? I mean, do we end up with this financial system that's 100% digital eventually?
Yeah, and for consumers, absolutely. As a consumer, you actually can live a fully digital financial life right now. You might not get access to certain types of products, but you'll be able to do most things. If your financial life is relatively simple, you can do it now. I think, so some of the interesting trends that we're seeing, FinTech obviously growing massively. The banks themselves, they're now actually launching digital versions of themselves. So Chase has done this, Capital One has done this, a number of other banks have started to launch these fully digital banks where you never have to walk into a bank branch. Really exciting. We're seeing more and more of that. We're now seeing the banks and the FinTech starting to both partner, meaning a FinTech will have a product and a bank will distribute that product to its customer base, and also compete, meaning the banks themselves are cloning FinTech products. Ultimately, this is amazing because the consumer wins, right? With more optionality, with more choices, the prices come down and the consumer gets more choice. And that really goes back to the thesis behind Plaid of making money easier for everyone. So we've seen a lot of that. We're actually seeing this interesting trend. Historically, bundling in banks was geographic. So you went into a bank, you went into the bank that was nearby. I grew up in North Carolina. I went to Wachovia Bank, which does not now exist anymore. But I went into Wachovia Bank, and that bank had every product for me, and I could live my entire financial life within that bank. But then I moved, and I had to get a new bank because Wachovia wasn't nearby. What we're actually seeing now is, as people have launched these point solutions, so let's take Robinhood recently, or let's take Marcus by Goldman Sachs, they have a couple of products, and they're building more and more products into that suite. But instead of clustering based on geography, they're clustering based on demographic. So they attract this specific high net worth demographic. What are the products that they're going to build for that entire demographic? And so you actually get these nuanced differences in the products that they're building because they're really holding tightly to that demographic and kind of growing with network effects, or at least most of the business that we see are growing with network effects. And so we're seeing demographic-based bundling of FinTech, which I think is really cool because the quality of product for that specific demographic is just so much higher than it ever was before when you didn't have to worry about serving all types of people or all types of use cases.
You know, what's perhaps obvious but very apparent through all your comments is the focus on consumer, right? Like we're coming from a world of financial services which were where there was quite often an adversarial relationship between the bank and the consumer and a feeling of rent extraction and all the things. and you as a leader in the space, but many others are all about the consumer.
Completely. I mean, consumers should be able to live the financial life that they want to live. It's core to our thesis. Our goal, we don't touch consumers, right? Oh, sorry, we don't directly touch consumers. But our goal is to create an ecosystem where the consumer wins. And when I say consumers, not just individuals, it's also small businesses, large businesses. There's a lot of business applications built on Plaid, but it's about the end customer that is getting the value out of financial services.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me open up to questions.
Thanks, Zach. So coming back to PSD2, I view it as an interesting experiment that is going on in Europe and UK with open banking, and the rest of the world is watching how it's going to end. Do you see it as an opportunity or a threat? Because other countries will probably follow. I don't know, Brazil enacted GDPR-like legislation, open banking will probably follow. Canada is thinking about that. What's your strategy about that?
I think it's great. It'll increase the velocity of applications because there is now a standard for it, and I think that's a really good position. The difficulty with thinking about PSD2, it's really hard in environments when there are a lot of banks, and it's easy when there are a few. So thinking about the UK, for example, CMA9 dominate market share, and it's easy to apply something that all 9 of those have to comply with. In the US, there's like 5,000 or so FDIC insured institutions, like 4,500 CONA institutions, a bunch of non-bank institutions that look like banks. It's really hard to do in the US, but I think net it's good for consumers, so we're excited.
Do you have any tools or applications that can handle micropayments, like a web-based system for
so that wouldn't be a product that we would build. That would be a product that a customer would build. But absolutely, I mean, I think creating kind of batch ACH micropayments is pretty straightforward. So we could enable some of the onboarding for that and some of the functionality, but that would be a customer of ours. If you're building one, please, that would be awesome.
One quick question. What is currently your largest consumer app client?
I can't say the answer to that. Sorry. You can guess at some of them. It's most of the big FinTech companies.
I know nothing, but like just looking at the website, Coinbase, Robinhood, American Express, Goldman Sachs.
They're all customers, yes.
They're all customers.
You got one over here.
Are you familiar with Monzo based in the UK?
Yes.
Would for those of you who do not know, Monzo is a totally digital mobile-only bank, no branches or anything like that. Are banks or new financial applications like that good clients for you guys, or where do you see them fitting into the picture?
Completely. That would be a great customer for us. If and when any of the neobanks from the UK launch in the US, we hope that we'll be working together.
Expanded in Europe, which you cannot comment on.
We may or may not have job applications there. So yeah, if that would be an interesting conversation for us if we were to go to Europe. I think it's actually interesting to see that there are some now U.S. banks. Goldman's Marcus team is like it's a completely digital bank. There's no branches. There are a number of kind of sub brands of major U.S. banks that also are completely digital already. So it's great to see Monzo and Revolut and others leading the way in Europe, and there's a lot of growth in the U.S. too.
Okay, maybe to close, do you want to talk about New York? You just bought a very large. I assume that was a very large company in New York for $200 million. So that's a major center and commitment for you guys now?
It is, yeah. New York is, we've always been in New York a lot. We've had an office here for a while, but now we have a more than 100-person office here. We're so excited to have brought on the Quovo team for a reported amount, to be clear. None of that is confirmed. But the Quovo team, they've built this amazing kind of investment-centric product. It was a gap in our product experience, and we're so excited to add it in. Also, all the individuals are amazing. But now we have 100 people in New York, growing that office quite quickly. If anyone's interested, please come chat with us or send me an email. I'm Zach@plaid.com.
And you're recruiting across the board.
Yeah, so we're recruiting across all offices, across all roles. So please chat with us. And if you interact with the team here in New York, I hope you'll give them good feedback. I think we might have a couple of Plaids here right now, but I hope you'll give them feedback or come ask some questions. We always love to meet people in the community.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for coming back. What an amazing journey. Congratulations. So excited for everything you've done in the future. Amazing. Thank you so much.
6 more years.